In today's video, I'm going to be doing another tier list where I rank every single card in Clash Royale because it's November now, and since the last tier list I've done, we've had the Little Prince added to the game and the Evolved Archers, which have completely changed the meta. Not to mention, we also had emergency balance changes, so as always, S tier is the highest rank a card can receive. It likely means it's very broken or extremely versatile. A tier means the card is pretty strong but might not quite need a nerf. B tier means it's kind of on the upper end of average. C tier is kind of average, lower end of average. D tier means the card is below average. And then F tier means the card is not versatile at all, or it just needs a buff. So starting off, guys, we got the regular archers, which I'm going to put in C tier right now. They're a little bit more versatile right now and being seen in more decks, but that's primarily because of their evolution. The regular archers, on the other hand, are fairly weak, especially because there's a lot of arrows in the meta. And at the very end, I'm going to rank the evolved cards. All the evolved cards, those are going to be at the end. At the beginning, it's going to be all the regular cards. So just wanted to state that early on. The arrows are going to go in A tier. They are definitely one of the best spells in the game. They're very consistent. They're a pretty safe spell to use because they're pretty cheap and have such a large radius, and they just pair so well in so many different things and are amazing against bait and just a bunch of swarmy type of decks. The Baby Dragon I'm going to put in B tier. It's a pretty decent flying splash card, but it's not super versatile because it's only mostly seen in things like Graveyard and Golem, but in those decks it definitely is pretty good. I'm going to say the Balloon right now is B tier. It's pretty good inside of Loon Cycle and Lava Loon, but because there's a lot of people running Buildings and the Tornado, it can be pretty difficult to get it to the tower compared to how it used to be. Also say the Bandit is around B tier. It's kind of a slightly above average card, pretty useful inside of bridge spam, but nothing too crazy. The Barbarian Barrel I'm going to put in A because it is absolutely insane inside of beatdown decks and control decks. It gets a ton of value using it on defense, and then you can also use it on offense too for a tiny bit of pressure. As per usual, the Barbarian Hut is going in the F tier, definitely one of the worst cards in the game, especially because of how good spells are against it, like Earthquake and Poison, causes it to get almost no value. The Barbarians are going to go in D tier. Keep in mind, though, these are just the regular Barbarians and not the evolved ones. The regular Barbarians are not that good because, for the most part, you can pretty much only get value out of them inside of Lava Hound decks. The Bats are going to go in C tier. They used to be one of the best cards in the game, but I feel like there's a lot of replacements for them now, and nowadays you mostly only see them inside of things like Mortar and Minor Wall Breakers, and they're fairly weak, especially the non-evolved version. The Healer I'm also going to say is F tier right now with the Barbarian Hut, because even though she got that buff where she spawns in with the heal, I feel like it wasn't quite enough and she's still not really that good. The Battle Ram I'm going to say is D tier. I feel like because there's a lot of buildings in the meta and bridge spam isn't in the best spot it's been in recently, it's not really that strong, especially as a win condition. The Bomb Tower right now, definitely one of the best buildings in the game. I'm going to say it's in S tier. The splash it has is just very useful, and it has a lot of hit points for only 4 elixir, so even spells like Earthquake and even Lightning don't even do all that amazing against it. The Bomber, I'm going to say, is around C tier right now. It's 2 elixir, so not high risk, but it's not really too great in the current meta. You're mostly only seeing it inside of Lava Hound, Golem decks, beatdown decks with E-Giant, things along those lines. It's not everywhere like it used to be in cycle decks like you would constantly see it with the Goblin Drill. The Bowler, on the other hand, I'm going to say is B tier right now. It's kind of seen a rise in usage rate recently because there's an E-Giant deck that pairs exceptionally well with the Bowler right now, and it just gets a lot of value on defense, and then when you're counter pushing with it, it can be quite a nuisance to deal with. The Cannon used to be a lot higher, but right now I'm going to put it at B tier because buildings such as the Bomb Tower and ones we will get to later are in a better spot than it right now, but with Hog and things like that, it can still be pretty valuable to have. Cannon Cart's going to be around C tier right now. I feel like it's kind of fallen off a little bit. You're not really seeing it a whole lot. Mostly you're only going to see it maybe inside of a Mortar deck or a Bridge Spam deck, but besides that, you're not really going to find it much. The Clone is going in F tier because it's pretty much useless right now. Even Lava Clone, I pretty much never play against it anymore, so you could argue even though the Clone is toxic, it might deserve a buff right now. The Dark Prince is a B tier card right now. It's very good inside of some of the heavier decks in this meta, like Goblin Giant and also Electro Giant Golem. You'll sometimes see it. It's a pretty useful splash card, and sometimes that shield can be pretty helpful. I'm I'm going to also say the Dark Goblin is around B tier right now. It's very effective inside of bait decks, those Rascal bait decks or Mortar bait decks. But with that being said, I feel like it's not quite versatile enough to be put in A or S tier right now. With that being said, though, he can be very, very annoying to deal with. The Earthquake I'm also going to put in B tier now. I think it's a very good spell to have, especially if you're using a Hog deck or Royal Hogs. It's essentially the only way you're going to be able to break through the building, so it's great to have. Right now, guys, I'm actually going to put the E-Drag in C tier because in this current meta, Golem E-Drag and Lumberloon E-Drag are both very, very strong decks right now, so the E-Drag has kind of seen a little bit more usage than it normally has, so I'm going to call it kind of an average card right now instead of D tier, which is where I usually put it. The E-Giant is going to be B tier right now. I feel like it's a pretty average win condition. It's pretty good right now, don't get me wrong, especially that new one with the Bowler and the Evolved Archers, but I don't think it's insanely broken, and I think it's not really the E-Giant itself in that deck that it's strong, and it's primarily the support cards. The E-Spirit I'm going to say is A because it's definitely one of the best spirits in the game, and it's so nice to have when you're running something like Royal Giant, Expo, or Hog, where a King activation doesn't matter quite as much, and it just gets so much value for that chain effect. The Ewiz is C tier right now. I think it's pretty average as a support card just because there's so many replacements and things you can use instead, like the Musketeer, the Archer Queen, you know, Little Prince, just things that kind of serve a similar purpose, so it has a hard time fitting in decks nowadays. The E-Barbs are also going to be in C tier. Sure, on mid-ladder, they could be pretty annoying to stop or when you're low on Elixir, but at the end of the day, they're pretty easy to distract with things like skeletons, goblins, and you can get pretty good positive elixir trades on them pretty consistently. I'm going to say the Elixir Collector right now is B tier. Usually I put it a little lower, but right now in this current meta, we're seeing a lot of decks with the pump, whether it's Golem, E-Giant, or just really off-meta spam decks like with the Recruits and the Goblin Giant, or even Pump Bows. So we're just seeing it in a lot of different decks, so I think it's pretty deserving of B tier. The Elixir Golem I'm actually going to say is D tier. Normally you would expect it to be an F, but I definitely consider it to be better than the Healer because pretty much every single E-Golem deck right now, or many of them anyway, aren't even using the Healer, and they're using things like the Evolved Barbarians or just other support cards instead, like with the Skelly King or spammy cards, so the E-Golem is actually somewhat viable right now. The Executioner, I'm going to say is C tier. I consider it pretty average now ever since it got that, I believe it was a health buff, and it's very good inside of minor control type of decks with the Bomb Tower and the Tornado. They're just very strong defensive decks, and it's very difficult sometimes to break through an Executioner depending on the deck you're using. The Fire Spirit I'm going to put in B tier. Of course, it's only one elixir, so it's pretty much no risk, and it gets a lot of value oftentimes for one elixir, but right now, there's not a whole lot of decks it pairs well in like it used to, so because it's not extremely versatile right now, I can't really put it much higher. Fireball, on the other hand, is going in A tier because it is for sure one of the best bigger spells in the game right now. Not the best, we'll get to that eventually, but it's very good, very consistent, and it's very nice to have in a lot of different control decks and also cycle decks, like maybe you're running 2.6 or Expo. It's kind of a must-have in those types of decks as well. I know the Firecracker's pretty annoying, but I can't really put it much higher than B tier because especially because of how many people are running arrows in this meta, and there are a lot of effective ways to counter it, but remember, this is just the regular Firecracker and not the Evolved. The Fisherman I'm going to put in B tier. Of course, it's not insanely versatile because you're mostly only going to see it inside of Royal Giant decks, or there's some newer Goblin Giant decks that have the Fisherman, but besides that, he's not used a ton, but when he is played, he gets so much value. Those King activations are just pulling things away from your win conditions. I'm also going to say the Flying Machine is B tier right now, definitely probably slightly above average, because there's a lot of people running it in Recruit Hogs right now, or also just in Lava. I'm seeing it sometimes, so it's in a pretty good place in this meta. The Freeze I'm going to put in D tier. It's definitely better than the Clone because you will sometimes see Graveyard Freeze, and also Lumberloon Freeze is in a fairly good spot right now too. So for that reason, it's definitely better than Clone, but it's still of course a below average spell by a really good amount. The Furnace, though, is also going in the F tier, one of the worst buildings in the game. It might even debatably be worse than the Barb Hut. It just kind of sucks, to be honest. The Giant's going in the D tier. I know it got that range buff, but I feel like that hardly helped the card, especially because Goblin Giant and just other tanks like Golem even are just way more effective right now, and there's pretty much no one running Giant Double Prince anymore either. If anyone's using the Giant, it's usually Giant Graveyard. The Giant Skeleton is also D tier. I don't really know what happened to the Giant Skeleton, to be honest, but it really has just kind of fallen out of the meta recently. Like, it kind of disappeared. It used to be everywhere, but now there's not really anyone using it or any deck where you have to have it. So for that reason, it's D tier. The Snowball is going to go in the C tier. I think it's a little bit underrated as a spell sometimes, to be honest, and I think the reason why it's not any higher than that is just because it's not as versatile compared to small spells like the Log. The Goblin Barrel is going to go in the D tier. I feel like it's not really that good ever since the Goblin first attack hit came in, because that really affected the card, but obviously Log Bait is just an archetype that is never gonna die. So right now the Goblin Cage is in B tier because Recruit Hogs are very good, and also there's some people running E-Giant with the Cage, and ever since it got that buff, it's definitely been a lot better. The Goblin Brawler got a small health buff, so now it doesn't die to lightning, for example. Right now, guys, I'm actually gonna say the Goblin Drill is D tier. I feel like it's definitely one of the worst win conditions in the game. It used to be one of the best. It was actually really broken, but I think after the nerf and kind of now that the meta shifted, it's really kind of fallen off a bit, and you're much better off just running something like a Miner. The Goblin Gang, I'm going to say, is B tier. I don't think it's super broken. The buff helped it a lot, but I think, you know, things like Goblins and some other alternatives are better than the Goblin Gang, but inside of Bait, it is definitely absolutely insane, and also Mortar too. Now, this is going to be our first S tier card. In the last tier list, I wasn't quite sure if it was deserving of S tier yet, but definitely, as time has proven, the Goblin Giant is for sure probably the best win condition in the game right now, or bare minimum top 2. Very broken right now. I would say that it could get maybe a 3% health nerf, because the buff it got was 6%, and that's a pretty massive health buff. So maybe they should take half of that away, and if it loses 3% of that buff, maybe it would be pretty balanced. The Goblin Hut, I'm also going to have an F tier. So pretty much all the spawners in the game, for the most part, are some of the worst cards in the game. It's just not that good. Kind of like the Barb Hut, there's so many people running Earthquake and Poison, it's just not really getting any value. The Goblins are going to be the second card in S tier. Now, I don't know if they necessarily need a big nerf or anything like that, but just because of how versatile they are, and now they've proven to be better than skeletons, and just kind of every cycle deck you're constantly seeing them in it because of the DPS they do, they're definitely S tier. Golden Knight is actually C tier right now. I'm not gonna lie, guys, a lot of the champions are pretty bad right now ever since Little Prince was added to the game, just because Little Prince is so much better than them, and it's like not even really close. And Golden Knight, before the Little Prince was added, was not even that good. So I'm gonna say it's C tier. It's kind of an average or below average card. The Golem, I'm gonna say, is B tier. I feel like it's in a pretty decent spot, especially that Golem pump deck. There's a lot of people using that, and I think, like, as a win condition overall, it's pretty decent, especially for how expensive it is. I'm gonna put the Graveyard in S tier. I think that it's for sure one of the most broken win conditions right now. It might even be kind of like on par with the Goblin Giant, especially because of the NRG aspect of it. Like, you don't know where the skeletons are going to spawn, and it's like, even if you have a poison, that doesn't even necessarily mean you're going to be able to fully counter it, or even have matchup against Graveyard, which is kind of crazy to think that Graveyard has almost like no counters. The guards are honestly like C or D tier right now. I feel like there's just so many better options, like the Goblin Gang, for example, like I already talked about, and the Goblins. You could even make the argument they're D tier. I just feel like there's really no point in using the guards right now. The Archer Queen is going to go in B tier. I definitely consider it a little better than the Golden Knight right now, but with that being said, the Archer Queen definitely, kind of like a lot of the other champions right now, are like not in all that great of a spot like they used to be when they first came out, you know, a year or two ago. So the Heal Spirit, I'm going to say, is C tier. I would say it's one of the worst spirits, but again, because it's one elixir and you can often get value out of it, especially inside of Birch Spam and Sparky decks, definitely not going to be any lower than C. The Hog Rider, I'm going to say, is A tier. It is for sure one of the best win conditions in the game right now, and you could even argue it's S tier. I think Hog has kind of survived a small nerf for a very long time now that I feel like it's potentially deserved. So let me know what you guys think. Do you guys think Hog deserves S tier? I feel like you could argue it's S. I honestly wouldn't mind seeing a Hog nerf, because I feel like for the last few years it has been a very consistent win condition, kind of like Graveyard. The Hunter, I'm going to say, is C tier, mostly because the only deck it's used in right now is Royal Giant, and I feel like Royal Giant isn't even in the best spot. With that being said, the Hunter's not a bad card, it's just not too versatile right now. The Ice Golem, I'm also going to say, is D tier. Actually, I'm going to say it's C, because the buff did help it a bit, but I mean, pretty much you're only seeing it in Loon Cycle or like Hog, that type of thing. So kind of like the Hunter, it's not really anything too crazy. Ice Spirit, though, I'm going to say is S. I think it's the best spirit in the game right now. The amount of value it gets for only one elixir, stalling everything for a lot of time, and just it gets so much value inside of cycle decks, and just paired with things like the goblins are just absolutely insane combinations. Usually I put the Ice Wizard in D tier, but right now I'm going to say it's C just because of how good Splash Yard is right now with the Tombstone, the Baby Dragon, that Splash Yard deck, and then also Graveyard Freeze, the Ice Wizard is very good in. Now, don't get me wrong, Ice Bow with the X-Bow, that deck is pretty much entirely dead, but because of Graveyard, Ice Wizard is definitely around C tier right now. The Inferno Drag, I'm going to say, is A tier. It is very useful to have inside of Lava Hound decks or also Graveyard Freeze, and there's a lot of essentially off meta decks you could pair it well into. I just think overall it's a very valuable card, and depending on the matchup, it can be kind of like make or break. Like, and just because of how valuable it can be in certain matchups is the reason why I usually rank it so high. It's just a very nice card to have against beatdown decks. It's certainly better than the Inferno Tower, which I'm going to put in C tier, because I feel like Inferno Tower is a little riskier to use since it's, one more elixir, and it's not that versatile. You can pretty much only run it in bait decks for the most part. The Knight, I'm going to say, is A tier. This isn't even the Evolved Knight. This is just the regular Knight, I believe, is A tier, because right now, especially because of the Evolved Knight, people have really realized how versatile the card is, and kind of like the Ice Spirit and the Goblins, pretty much you're going to be able to run it in every single cycle deck you want. The Lava Hound right now definitely is going to be C tier. The argument could even be made it's D tier. The nerf definitely did affect it quite a lot, but I'm going to say it's C tier right now, for now at least, because you definitely can still use Lava. It's just going to be noticeable the nerf it got, and it's not going to be able to tank for things like Balloon or your other support cards for nearly as long as it used to. Right now, I'm going to say the Lightning is around B tier. You're seeing it a good amount inside of Golem or E-Giant, but besides that, you're not seeing it, as much as other spells such as the Poison, the Fireball, so it definitely isn't deserving of A tier. Now, right now, I'm going to say the Lumberjack is B tier. Normally, I'd put it lower, but it's very good inside of Golem and also Lumberloon Freeze, which are pretty strong decks in this current meta, so I'm going to say right now it's B tier. Magic Archer took quite a hit after the nerf it got. It was in A tier, and now I believe it goes all the way down to C tier after that first attack nerf, because that's a pretty substantial and noticeable nerf to the card, changing a lot of interactions. I'm going to put the Mega Knight in C tier as well. I think it's in an okay spot. It's kind of when you think of an average card in the game, honestly, like Mega Knight is one of the first ones that comes to mind. It's very good inside of Mega Knight Wall Breakers, which is actually a very good deck right now with the Little Prince. Honestly, I'm going to say the Mega Minion is D tier because there isn't really any deck you need to use it in, especially when you have things like the Phoenix, the Skeleton Dragons, and just other alternatives. You don't really, and Lava, sure, you could use it, but I really don't think it is anything too crazy. The Mighty Miner, I'm also going to say, is around B tier right now, kind of like some of the other champions. It's just not as broken as it used to be. I mean, you could still use it if you want, though, in the Recruit Spam deck. It's very good, and then you could also run it in stuff like Hog and Logbait, so by no means is it completely dead. It's still a pretty decent card. I'm going to put the Miner in A tier. You could definitely make the argument it's S tier because it's just so versatile and it's just so strong, but I think some of the other cards that I have in S so far, and the ones that'll be included, later on in this video, need a priority over, considering a nerf than the Miner. So that's why I'm saying the Miner's A. It's very strong, but I don't really think it needs a nerf right now, at least. The Mini P.E.K.K.A. I'm going to say is B tier because in this current meta, I'm seeing a lot of people use it, especially with the Goblin Giant decks. It's a very nice combination with that. And then also, it's a pretty good counter to the Little Prince as well. The Minion Horde, I'm going to say, is C tier right now. It's pretty good with the Skeleton King. You could use it in Lava if you want Mortar Bait. So it's not bad, but definitely a slightly below average card. Now, the Minions, I'm going to say, are B tier because they pair exceptionally well with the Goblin Giant, and also Lava. It's very common that you see minions, so I think the minions are pretty decent right now. The Mirror, I'm going to put in F tier as per usual because once again, it's like you're spending one elixir to play the same thing, and in most cases that's not going to be valuable for you, and sometimes it's just a card that is kind of a dead space in your cycle and just makes it kind of awkward. The Monk is also joining the Golden Knight in the C tier because I think that it's pretty bad right now. I'm seeing pretty much no one use it. In fact, you could even make the argument the monk is in D tier and not C, but I guess C is a pretty reasonable spot for it. I'm going to say the mortar's in B tier right now. It used to be ranked higher as a building, but at this point in time, there's definitely been noticeably less people running mortar, but you still from time to time see some people running hog mortar or miner mortar, but I just think the bomb tower overall right now is definitely better as a building. The Mother Witch is also going to go in B tier. It's pretty decent inside of Goblin Giant decks, but because beyond Goblin Giant you're not seeing it much, it's not, I feel like, quite versatile enough to be deserving of an A tier. But with that being said, it is a fairly nice counter to have against Graveyard as well, which there is a lot of in this meta. I'm going to say the Musketeer is also B tier. I just think overall she's a pretty solid support card to have inside of hog decks or mortar decks, things along those lines. The Night Witch I'm going to say is D tier right now because you mostly only see her inside of Golem decks, and even inside of Golem, she's not even really a requirement and you could use something else instead. I guess you see her in E-Golem too, but yeah, you kind of get the point. Honestly, guys, this might sound kind of crazy, but I'm going to put the P.E.K.K.A. in F tier because I kind of would like to see the P.E.K.K.A. get a buff because I genuinely think it is one of the worst cards in the game right now, especially ever since the Recruit evolution came in, which is just an absolute hard counter to the P.E.K.K.A. And just all the other things and changes have happened. I feel like the P.E.K.K.A. has just slowly over time gotten weaker and weaker, so I'm going to say F tier because I wouldn't mind seeing a P.E.K.K.A. buff. The Phoenix I'm going to say is A tier, finally not in S tier anymore, but that's the reason why I put Mega Minion so low and things like Baby Dragon lower than it, because it just is better than it, you know? It's just the best option to have in a lot of decks. It's a very versatile card. The Poison I'm going to put in S tier. It's definitely better than the Fireball right now. We're seeing loads of people running, you know, Graveyard Poison, Splash Yard, and then of course you have Miner Poison, and there's even some people right now running Hog Poison. They're preferring to use Poison over the Earthquake, and there's just a lot of different combinations you can run with the Poison, and then the decks they are used in the Poison sometimes feels like is what's actually carrying the deck. The Prince I'm going to put in D tier. I feel like it's really not that good because you can only use him in Giant Double Prince or potentially Prince Bait, but those aren't even used very much anyway. Same with the Princess because, of course, in Log Bait, she's going to be very good, but in other decks, not so much. Now, the Rage I'm going to put in A tier because right now, you have decks like Goblin Giant Sparky, and even not even just that, but you see just some really toxic spammy type of decks with the Elixir Collector or the Recruits. Sometimes you'll see the Rage with it, and it's just a very versatile card, and then the decks it's used in, sometimes it can be the card that ends up winning you the game. The Ramrodder I'm going to say is C tier right now. You could use it if you want, and there are some people using some different variations of it, but overall as a win condition, definitely struggling right now in the meta, and it certainly doesn't help that E-Giant is in a pretty good spot right now, which is obviously one of the best counters to the Ramrodder. I'm going to say the Rascals are in C tier, even though they're not that versatile. I don't really want to put them much lower than C because I don't think they're necessarily a bad card. It's more so that just in the meta, they just don't really fit at all because the Rascal Girls, they do a lot of DPS, and I just think when they are played, they sometimes can, you know, alone win a game. It's just the problem is they don't fit well in a lot of decks. The Rocket, though, I'm going to say is D tier because ever since I got that nerf to the Crown Tower damage, it just hasn't really been the same since then, and you're really only seeing it inside a Log Bait, and now sometimes Log Bait you'll see be played without the Rocket in it. The Delivery I'm going to say right now is B tier because we're seeing a lot of Delivery Bomb Tower decks, especially with the Little Prince, and we're just seeing it get used so valuably on defense. But, of course, there are spells better than it, which is why it's kind of like among the spells around average. The Ghost right now is B tier. I used to always put it in A, but I think at this point in time in the meta, because there's not a ton of Bridge Spam and Royal Giant that had the Royal Ghost a lot, I think it goes lower a tier, but with that being said, it is still insanely strong. Now, the Royal Giant, I'm actually going to put in C tier because, and this is the regular Royal Giant, not the evolved one, but I think the regular Royal Giant right now is honestly kind of weak as win condition. It's probably the weakest it's been in a very, very long time, just because of a lot of the meta shifts, and I honestly think things like Little Prince are just an incredible counter to it as well. The Royal Hogs are going to go in B tier. They're very good, especially because of the Royal Recruits, and then not even just the Royal Recruits, you also have some Royal Hog cycle decks with the Little Prince and the Cannon you could use as well, so they're definitely versatile enough and strong enough to be considered B tier, I would say. The recruits, and these are just the regular recruits, I'm going to put in C tier because the Little Prince, Bomb Tower, and a lot of things like that do pretty good against them, so I think the regular recruits are honestly not really that scary. It's mostly the evolved recruits that are pretty strong, so I would say the regular ones are kind of just an average card. The Skeleton Army I'm going to put in D tier because there isn't really any deck that you need to use the Skeleton Army in. I mean, you might see it from time to time in Giant Graveyard, but it's kind of like even in that, you don't even really have to use it. The Skeleton Barrel, though, I'm going to put in C tier. I think it's a little better than the Skeleton Army because you can use it in Mortar decks. You can use it also in that Recruit Spam deck with the Mighty Miner. The Skeleton Barrel is actually very, very nice in that deck, so recently it's been a little better, so I kind of consider it average-ish. Skeleton Dragons, I'm going to put in A tier right now. I feel like this is kind of a sleeper card, one that's a little bit underrated and people don't realize how strong it is. I definitely don't think they need a nerf, but if you think about it, you can use it in so many different decks. You see them often in Lava Hound decks, Golem decks, and not even that, but sometimes you see them in, you know, cheaper decks that are faster cycle. Like they're a really good card to have inside of Mortar decks or Miner decks. So I just think overall, ever since they got that health buff, people have really realized how versatile they are and how strong they can be in many different kinds of decks. Right now, I'm going to put the Skeleton King in B tier because I definitely would say the Skeleton King is better than the Golden Knight and the Monk right now, and I would say right now he's about the same as the Mighty Miner and the Archer Queen, so B tier is kind of around where he belongs, and again, a large part of this is because of the Little Prince that is just a lot better than all the other champions right now. Skeletons are going to go in A tier, don't get me wrong, they're very strong, but when you compare them to the Goblins, they just kind of do the same thing, but better for only one more elixir. The Sparky's going to go in B tier right now. I know there's a lot of people that think the Sparky's pretty OP right now, but if we're being honest here, it's mostly the Goblin Giant because we're not seeing that many people run Giant Sparky or non-Goblin Giant Sparky decks. It's pretty much always with the Goblin Giant, so I do believe that if the Goblin Giant does get a small nerf, we'll probably see the Sparky return to not being as good as it was before. The Spear Goblins are also going to be going in B tier. They're pretty good inside of minor decks like the Remieli deck, or if you want to run them obviously in Mortar, Logbait, they're going to be very good in those types of things. The Tesla, I'm going to say, is B tier. I don't think it's quite as good as the Bomb Tower right now, but inside of Hog, especially in Expo, it's kind of a must-have in those types of decks right now. There's a lot of people who are preferring to run Tesla inside of Hog now just so you're able to beat air decks a lot easier. The Log is going in S tier. Even though it's gotten a few nerfs over the last couple of years, it has not been nearly enough to take it out of S tier. It is still, without a doubt, the best small spell in the game. It just gets so much value for only 2 elixir. It's so versatile, and yeah, you guys probably already know that already. I'm going to say the Three Musketeers right now are D tier because there's so many people that are running Poison in this meta. There's more delivery. There's Bomb Tower. So I just feel like they're not really that good. Tombstone, I'm going to put in A tier. Definitely one of the best buildings in the game, primarily because of Splash Shard. But then, of course, inside a Lava Hound, the Tombstone is also getting a very good amount of value as well. The Tornado is going in S tier because it's just for the longest time been such a consistent spell, and I feel like it bails people out of games, and it just gets way too much value on defense, and then not even on defense, you can also use it offensively, you know, to pool things together, like pool things into the E-Giant Circle or whatever. There's just so many different uses and ways you can use the Tornado, and I think a small nerf is justified at this point. I'm going to say the Valkyrie is B tier just because I think the Knight is pretty much preferred over her in pretty much every single deck, but that doesn't mean she's necessarily a bad card. It's just that Knight is better right now. The Wall Breakers are going to go in A tier. I actually think they're one of the best win conditions in the game right now, especially with the Little Prince. We've seen a lot of people running, minor wall breakers, or even Mega Knight wall breakers is a pretty popular deck right now, and they're 2 elixirs, so they're just very low risk, and they do so much damage. Honestly, guys, I'm going to put both the Witch and the Wizard in F tier. Before, I used to always put the Wizard in F and not the Witch, but it's become time that I kind of want to see either one of them get buffed. I don't really care which one does. I just think both of them do. The Wizard might need one slightly more, but they're both pretty bad right now. I mean, because so many people are just running delivery, poison, and honestly, I think a good buff to the Wizard would be to make it survive poison. That would be pretty decent. I don't really know, but they're both just not good right now. The Expo also not really that good right now. I'm going to put that in D tier, and then the Zap is also going to go in D tier. I think that Zap is actually one of the worst spells in the game right now. And then the Zappies are going to go in B tier. I think they're, okay. They're kind of like average-ish right now, but they're definitely not as strong as they used to be. So now let's get into where I would rank the Little Prince and the evolutions. I'm going to have to add those in manually because they are not on the list. Alright guys, so starting off with the new Little Prince champion, he is definitely going in S tier. Even though he already got 2 emergency nerfs, he has proven to be by far still the best champion in the game, and because of how versatile he is, he can pair well in so many different decks. That's why he's still, after those 2 nerfs, come out on top and has definitely shaped up the meta and the decks used, so I think he's well deserving of S tier. Do they need to emergency nerf him again right away? I would say probably not, but maybe at the end of the month or next month, he definitely might be deserving of another small nerf. The most broken evolution in the game right now, in my opinion, is the evolved archers. I think they're the best evolution. They just do so much damage when they're far away, and that fire rate increase and the health increase, the fact that they don't die to arrows, all those things makes them incredibly strong, and they're very versatile too, because not only are they good in cycle decks, they're very good inside of E-Giant right now too, and heavier decks, so you can use them in all sorts of decks. The second best evolution, in my opinion, even after that pretty big nerf it got, is the Evolved Knight. Still coming out on top, better than a lot of the other evolutions, because kind of like the archers, he's extremely versatile, especially going to be very good inside of cycle decks, but you could also use him inside of heavier decks like Goblin Giant too. The third best evolution in the game, guys, believe it or not, I think is the Evolved Skeletons. Ever since they got that buff, and now that their first attack is quicker, they're way more likely to spawn and just overwhelm your opponent, and I've seen tons of clips recently of just them being so annoying, and you have to be so careful with your spells playing on them properly, and depending on the deck you're using or your cycle, you might not even have that spell in cycle anyways, which they're just pretty much going to be completely unstoppable, especially on defense. The fourth best evolution in the game right now, in my opinion, are the Evolved Barbarians. They definitely took quite a hit after they got that small health and damage nerf, and then of course with some of the other evolutions just being better than them, that's why they're fourth, but they're still extremely strong, which is why they're still in the S tier. And then the last evolution that I would consider S tier would be the Evolved Recruits. They definitely are a bit worse after that damage nerf they did end up getting, but with that being said, I still think they're very strong, especially them having that extra health, and their charge effect makes them kind of annoying to deal with. Now, the rest of these are going in the A tier. I believe the sixth best evolution right now are the Evolved Bats. Now, the buff definitely helped them a little bit. It's just not quite as strong, though, as some of the other evolutions, because they're not guaranteed to get that heal. If you're quick with your spells or taking them out, them attacking quicker at the beginning doesn't necessarily help them a ton. But I would say the buff they got was definitely deserving, because it goes to show even after the buff they got, they're still not that great. I'd say number 7 right now is the Evolved Royal Giant. It's just not really that great in comparison to some of the others, because a lot of the other evolutions are just a really good counter to him, which is probably why he's like lower on the list, because stuff like the Evolved Archers and the Evolved Barbarians just absolutely melt him. So if you're playing against those things when you're running the Royal Giant, it's really hard to get to the tower. Number 8 is going to be the Evolved Firecracker. This one might be a little controversial, because I know a lot of mid-ladder players would probably put her higher on the list, but the main reason why is she just doesn't have as good synergy as, say, the Evolved Archers, for example, but still, you could run the Evolved Firecracker if you want inside of Hog decks, but you're probably just going to be better off running the Evolved Archers, which are just significantly better right now. And last but not least, obviously this is still in the A tier, but we have the Evolved Mortar. I just feel like right now the evolved mortar and just mortar in general has a really hard time locking on the tower for whatever reasons, and just mortar is not in a great spot because there's just a lot of distractions for it right now, a lot of tanks, and just because quite frankly a lot of the evolutions are just way better than it right now. So that's my list. What do you guys think?